They shot him, left him there to die, bleeding out on the cold, desolate ground. The Galactic hunters laughed, thinking they had won. But they didn't know one thing. The Reaper was coming. The planet was silent, save for the faint wind howling across the barren landscape. The ground, cracked and lifeless, stretched out in all directions, casting long shadows under the greenish sky. There was no sign of life, only the remnants of a forgotten world. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Jacob, a human soldier, lay in the dust, his body torn and bleeding. He could feel the life slipping out of him, each heartbeat slower than the last. His vision blurred, but he could still make out the shapes of the Galactic hunters around him. The insectoid creatures stood tall, their gleaming black armor reflecting the eerie light. They were the elite, hunter-killers, feared across the galaxy for their ruthless efficiency. One of them, the leader, stood directly over him, a twisted sneer crossing its face. Its mandibles clicked together in amusement as it looked down at Jacob. Hunter leader, pathetic. You thought you could challenge us, little human? The creature's voice was cold, mocking. This is where your story ends. Jacob's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. Blood pooled around him, the pain in his body overwhelming. His rifle lay discarded a few feet away, useless in the face of his inevitable death. Jacob, weakly, you don't know who you're dealing with. The leader's laughter echoed through the air, his elongated tongue flicking out in amusement. The rest of the hunters joined in, their eerie, high-pitched voices mingling in cruel harmony. Hunter 2. Does he think we're afraid of his pathetic threats? Hunter 3. What's he going to do, talk us to death? Jacob's lips twitched into a pained smile, though his strength was failing. With every breath, he felt the coldness of death creeping closer. But he wasn't afraid. He knew what was coming. Jacob, you've never met Reaper. The words barely left his lips before the hunters erupted in laughter. To them, it was just a final, desperate act of defiance. But to Jacob, it was the truth. And the truth had a way of biting back, even when no one else believed it. The leader knelt down closer, its multifaceted eyes narrowing. Hunter leader, Reaper? What are you babbling about? There is no Reaper here. Only your death. Jacob could feel his body shutting down, his vision fading. But just before everything went black, he whispered one last word. Jacob, you'll see soon enough. The hunters, satisfied that their prey was near death, turned to leave. They had bigger trophies to hunt, other humans to break, and they weren't about to waste any more time here. The leader gave one last glance at Jacob, a final sneer curling across its face before it turned and walked away. A figure stood far off in the distance, watching from the edge of the rocky ridge. Cloaked in shadow, silent as a specter, he had been there for moments, hours perhaps, waiting. The Reaper never rushed. He never needed to. His enemies came to him, one by one, and that was how he liked it. His mission was simple, to ensure the galaxy learned to fear humanity. And when he arrived, they would learn it all too well. His helmet glinted slightly in the dim light, its sleek, black surface a reflection of the ruthless efficiency within. Unlike the Galactic hunters, he wasn't there for sport. He didn't revel in the kill. He simply killed. That's what he was, a tool. A weapon forged in the darkest corners of war. But as the leader of the hunters continued to mock their fallen prey, something changed. The wind shifted, the silence deepened. And then, the first shot rang out. The sound was faint, like a distant thunderclap, but the effect was instant. The lead hunter stumbled, a loud, shocked hiss escaping its throat. A small, perfectly placed hole appeared in the center of its chest, a delicate piece of human ingenuity. The remaining hunters froze, turning in unison toward the source of the shot. But they saw nothing. No movement. No enemy in sight. Hunter 2. What the? Before he could finish the thought, another shot rang out. This time, a hunter's head exploded, the creature's body collapsing into a heap. No one had even seen the shooter. The remaining hunters scrambled for cover, fear starting to creep into their alien minds. They had underestimated humanity, and now it was too late. The hunter leader barked an order. Hunter leader, find him. Hunt him down. He's one human. We're dozens. But it wasn't about numbers. The Reaper had known that from the start. From his position on the ridge, Reaper methodically picked off each hunter with precision, his shots calculated and efficient. He wasn't killing out of anger, nor for the thrill. He was sending a message. The leader of the hunters attempted to flee, darting behind a cluster of rocks, but Reaper had already anticipated the move. With a calm breath, he adjusted his aim, and a single shot later, the leader crumpled to the ground. Jacob, still barely conscious, managed to lift his head slightly as he saw the last hunter fall. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the haze of blood and pain, Jacob's lips formed a tired smile. "Jacob, told you he'd come." Reaper walked slowly toward him, his heavy footsteps muffled by the wind. He didn't rush. He never did. When he reached Jacob, he knelt beside him, his gaze unreadable behind the dark visor of his helmet. "Reaper, you're not dead yet." Jacob's smile widened slightly, despite the pain. "Jacob, I knew you'd come." "Reaper, I was sure of it." Reaper didn't respond. He simply lifted Jacob from the ground, slinging him over his shoulder. There was no time for words now. The rest of the mission still lay ahead. As Reaper carried Jacob away, the battlefield remained still. The hunters were dead, their bodies scattered across the sand. And the message had been sent. Humanity was not to be underestimated. The air was colder now, the wind howling as if mourning the fallen. The barren landscape stretched endlessly, a haunting reminder of a planet abandoned by life. Yet, despite the desolation, a faint light flickered in the distance, a shimmer of human resilience. Jacob had lost track of time after being slung over Reaper's shoulder. His vision swam in and out of focus, the world around him blurring like a fading dream. Every step Reaper took reverberated through his bones, the soldier's gait steady and unhurried. As much as Jacob's body screamed for rest, he couldn't help but admire the quiet professionalism of the man who carried him. His breath came in shallow gasps, but he managed to speak. "Jacob, you came just in time." Reaper didn't reply immediately. His movements were methodical, as if nothing could ever surprise him. The helmet glinted darkly in the fading light, hiding any emotion, any hint of humanity. But Jacob knew better than to assume the man was simply a machine. He wasn't. Not completely. "Jacob, how many times have you done this?" Reaper finally slowed, setting Jacob down against a nearby rock. The human soldier was too weak to stand on his own, but that was fine. He could rest now. For a moment, the world seemed still. Reaper's voice, low and steady, cut through the silence. "Reaper, enough." Jacob wanted to ask more, to know who this person really was, what drove him, why he wore the name Reaper like a badge of honor. But he had no strength to form the words. He just watched as the man surveyed their surroundings, his eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk. The moment was interrupted by the crackle of an old comm unit. Reaper reached for the device on his belt, flicking it to life. The static buzzed for a moment before a familiar voice came through. "Voice, Reaper, report in. Status of the mission?" It was a calm, professional voice, the voice of command. "Reaper, target neutralized. The hunters are dead." There was a pause, a moment of silence from the other side. Then the voice came back, tinged with a hint of relief. "Voice, understood. Get out of there. We've got an extraction ready. You'll have backup soon." "Reaper, I don't need backup, but you'll need to get him out of here." Jacob could hear the faint sound of gears clicking as Reaper moved, preparing to leave. But his words caught in his throat. There was something unsettling about the way Reaper had spoken. It wasn't just that he didn't need backup. It was that he wasn't waiting for it. "Not for this. Jacob, I'm not dead yet, you know." Reaper's helmet tilted just slightly, as though considering the comment. Then, without a word, he reached down and hoisted Jacob up once more. The coldness of the night pressed in, but Jacob could feel the warmth of Reaper's presence. In that moment, he was certain this man was more than just a soldier. They moved through the rocky terrain in silence, the crunch of their boots the only sound accompanying them. Reaper was relentless in his pace, and Jacob struggled to keep up, but he wasn't about to slow him down. Not after everything that had happened. As they moved deeper into the canyons, Jacob's mind wandered back to the ambush. He couldn't understand why they had attacked. Sure, they were hunters, but the hunters were known for their brutal tactics. They hunted not just for sport, but for blood. They believed that defeating humanity would break their spirit. What they didn't realize was that the opposite was true. Humanity was resilient. Even when they thought they were on the verge of collapse, they always found a way to rise. "Jacob, why do they keep doing it, Reaper?" "These These hunters, why go after us? Reaper didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the environment, looking for any sign of movement. The question lingered in the air like an unanswered prayer. When he finally spoke, his voice was as cold as the wind. Reaper, they believe if they destroy enough of us, we'll break. They think we'll stop fighting. That's why they keep coming. Jacob could feel the weight of those words. It wasn't just the physical battle that mattered to the hunters. It was the war for the soul. They wanted to strip humanity of its defiance, its fight. They wanted to show the galaxy that humans could be crushed, humbled, and made to bow. Jacob, you think they'll ever succeed? Reaper's gaze hardened as he stared ahead, his pace unrelenting. Reaper, no, because they'll never understand. Humans don't break. As they continued on, the faint hum of distant engines reached their ears. The extraction team was close. It wouldn't be long before they were off this forsaken planet. But Jacob could feel something stirring in him, something far deeper than just survival. He wasn't the same soldier who had fallen under the hands of the hunters. He had seen the power of humanity's will, the force that Reaper embodied so effortlessly. But there was more to Reaper than just strength. There was something about him, an air of mystery that Jacob couldn't shake. He had always been a soldier, but Reaper was something else. As they reached the extraction point, a dropship descended from the sky, its engines cutting through the thick atmosphere. The ground shook as the ship touched down, and Jacob's legs nearly gave out beneath him, his body still not fully recovered from the brutal ambush. Reaper's hands steadied him, and the soldier didn't protest. Reaper, get on. You'll make it back. Jacob nodded, but before he climbed aboard, he turned to Reaper. There was a moment of quiet acknowledgement between them. Reaper didn't speak, but the gesture was enough. They both knew that the mission wasn't over. The galaxy was vast, and humanity was just beginning to make its mark. As Jacob boarded the ship, Reaper stood alone on the desolate planet's surface, his dark figure standing out against the night. And in that silence, the galaxy could feel it, a whisper, an echo of something larger, something unstoppable. Humanity had sent its message, and the Reaper had made sure they'd heard it loud and clear. The journey back to the main base was a blur for Jacob. He could barely remember boarding the dropship or the trip through the galaxy's cold emptiness. His mind was still reeling from the ambush, the pain, and the unexpected arrival of Reaper. He had thought death was certain, yet here he was, alive and breathing, back in the safety of a ship that hummed with energy. But as the ship sped through the void, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that his survival meant something more. It wasn't just about being saved. It was about the message that Reaper had delivered. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would shake the galaxy to its core. As the ship entered orbit around a large, bustling space station, Jacob finally allowed himself to relax. The pain in his body had dulled, though his thoughts were still scattered. He was barely able to stand as he was escorted off the ship and into the sterile, metallic halls of the station. Jacob, I never thought I'd make it back here. The soldier next to him, a fellow member of his unit, glanced at him with a nod. Soldier, you're one of the lucky ones. Not many make it out alive after a hit like that. Jacob didn't respond. He wasn't thinking about luck. He was thinking about Reaper. The man had saved him, but there was more to his story than anyone realized. Jacob had seen the way Reaper moved, calculating, cold, efficient. It wasn't just skill, it was a lifetime of battle. And somehow, Jacob knew it wasn't the first time he'd seen those kinds of moves. The doors to the medical bay slid open, and Jacob was ushered inside. As the medics began to work on him, patching up the wounds from the hunter's attack, his thoughts drifted back to Reaper. He couldn't get the man's words out of his head. Reaper, humans don't break. It was a simple statement, but it rang true. The hunters, the alien forces that threatened humanity, none of them understood the tenacity that drove humans. They had seen it before, but they never fully grasped it. No matter how many times they were knocked down, humans always found a way to rise. And Reaper was living proof of that. A few hours later, Jacob was back on his feet, his wounds bandaged and his strength returning. He hadn't expected to feel this good so quickly, but the human body had a way of surprising him. He headed toward the command center, intent on finding some answers. Inside, the station's officers were gathered around a holographic map of the galaxy. They were focused on the data coming in from various sectors, but the moment Jacob entered, their conversation paused. Commander, Ah, the survivor. You're looking better than I expected. Jacob gave a tired smile. He had been in the military long enough to know how to handle this kind of attention. Jacob, I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I need to know more about Reaper. The room went silent, the officers exchanging cautious glances. It wasn't often that someone asked about the Reaper. He was a figure wrapped in mystery. Rumors about him spread throughout the ranks, but no one knew the full truth. Commander, you're not the first person to come back with questions about him. The truth is, Reaper is not like the rest of us. He's not part of any official military force, not exactly. He operates on his own, doing things we can't even imagine. Jacob frowned, his curiosity deepening. Jacob, what do you mean not like the rest of us? The commander leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Commander, Reaper is a soldier, yes. But he's also something else. Something darker. Some say he was part of an old, classified program. A kind of soldier made for war, bred to be a weapon. Jacob's mind raced. He had heard stories of secret operations, of genetic manipulation and enhanced soldiers, but this was something entirely different. Reaper wasn't just a trained killer. He was a product of something much more sinister. Jacob, so he's a weapon? Commander, in a sense. But it's more complicated than that. We don't know exactly how he was created or why he was chosen for this mission. All we know is that he's been hunting down the galaxy's most dangerous threats for years, alone, and never once failed. Jacob stood in stunned silence, the weight of the commander's words sinking in. Reaper wasn't just a soldier. He was something engineered for war, created to kill. And yet, in his eyes, Jacob had seen something else, a flicker of humanity, of choice, hidden beneath the cold exterior. Before Jacob could ask more questions, the door to the command center opened, and Reaper himself stepped inside. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. The officers knew better than to challenge him, but Jacob's curiosity couldn't be contained. Jacob, Reaper, I have questions. Reaper's helmet turned to face him, and for a moment, Jacob swore he saw a flash of recognition in the cold, reflective surface. Reaper, and I have answers. But not here. Without another word, Reaper turned and walked out of the room, his presence dominating the space around him. Jacob didn't hesitate, he followed. They walked through the station's darkened halls, the low hum of machinery the only sound between them. Reaper led Jacob to a secluded room, one that had the distinct air of a place where secrets were kept. Jacob, I need to understand what you are. Reaper stood still, his posture as rigid as ever, his voice unchanging. Reaper, I was created for war, but I fight for something greater now, for humanity's survival, not as a soldier, but as a guardian. Jacob could hear the weight of the words. For the first time, Reaper wasn't just talking about his mission, he was talking about something personal, something that went beyond the battlefront. Jacob, what changed? Reaper's helmet shifted slightly, as though he was considering the question. Then, with a finality that left no room for doubt, he answered, Reaper, you did. The room was eerily quiet as Reaper's words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Jacob stood frozen, processing the gravity of what had just been said. You did. He couldn't understand it at first, but then the pieces began to fall into place. He had seen Reaper act with cold efficiency, the way he carried out his missions without hesitation. But now, Jacob was beginning to see that Reaper wasn't just a weapon. He was more. There was something personal in his mission. Jacob, me? I don't understand. How could I have changed anything for you? Reaper's voice was calm, but there was an undertone of something deeper, something unspoken. Reaper, you survived. Against all odds. The others, they didn't. They fell, and I kept moving. But you lived. You showed me something I had forgotten. Jacob tried to make sense of it, but it was like trying to piece together a shattered mirror. Reaper was a soldier, a machine, a guardian. He was all these things, but Jacob hadn't yet realized how far that bond between soldier and survivor could go. It wasn't just about protecting him. It was about something much bigger, something rooted in the very soul of humanity itself. It was a reminder. Jacob, what did I show you? Reaper turned, his movements as silent as the grave. For a moment, Jacob thought he might not answer. But then, in a voice that felt almost human, Reaper spoke. Reaper, hope. The word hung in the air like a phantom, and Jacob couldn't quite grasp it. Hope? He had seen Reaper do unimaginable things, had felt the weight of his actions. Hope had always felt so distant, something fragile, something to be guarded. But now, in this cold room, it seemed to pulse between them. Jacob, but you're a weapon. Created to kill. That's all you've known. Reaper paused, a deep silence stretching between them. Then, slowly he spoke. Reaper, I was created to fight, to be efficient. But what makes me human is my ability to choose. I choose to protect. And you gave me that reminder. Jacob's mind raced, trying to grasp the significance of Reaper's words. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Reaper wasn't just a soldier or a killer. He was someone who had made a choice to fight for humanity, to guard it, to preserve it. And Jacob had unwittingly played a part in that. But there was still so much Jacob didn't understand. Reaper had been part of a secret program, bred for war. How could he, a product of that darkness, still choose hope? Was it really possible to break free from the past, to move beyond what had been created in him? Jacob, what happened before? Before I met you? Before all of this? Reaper's gaze turned distant, his expression unreadable beneath his helmet. For the first time, Jacob saw a flicker of something vulnerable in him. Reaper, I don't remember everything. I was trained, programmed. My early memories are fragments. But I know enough to understand my purpose. I know enough to understand you, Jacob. There was a sharpness to Reaper's voice, a quiet determination that made Jacob shiver. The truth was, Jacob hadn't seen the full scope of Reaper's past, but he had glimpsed something more human than he had ever expected. And with that glimpse came a deep sense of respect. Whatever Reaper had been through, whatever his past held, he had become something more than just the product of war. He had become a guardian of humanity's future. Jacob, and now? What happens now? Reaper didn't hesitate. His voice was firm, the decision made. Reaper, now we fight. We fight because they want to take what's ours. The hunters, the invaders, whoever they are. We fight because humanity deserves to be more than a victim. Jacob's pulse quickened. The fire in Reaper's words resonated deep within him. He had felt it before, the fierce, unrelenting urge to protect, to defend humanity at all costs. It was a call to arms, not just for himself, but for all of humanity. But something in Reaper's tone told Jacob there was more at stake than just the battle in front of them. There was a war being waged within Reaper himself. A war between the soldier he had been and the guardian he was becoming. Between duty and choice. Jacob, you're not just a soldier, are you? Reaper's response was short but packed with meaning. Reaper, no. And I never was. As Jacob and Reaper prepared for the next phase of their mission, they found themselves once again in the shadows of war. The galaxy was full of threats, more than they had even begun to realize. But Jacob had come to understand something vital. Reaper was more than just an instrument of destruction. He was a protector. And together, they would face whatever came next. But as the two of them geared up for the next mission, Jacob couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the true battle hadn't even begun yet. They weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for the soul of humanity itself. And in that fight, Reaper would be their greatest weapon. The stars outside the station flickered like 1,000 tiny eyes watching their every move. Inside the command center, the air was thick with tension. Jacob stood with his back to the holographic map of the galaxy, his fingers tapping restlessly on the console. Reaper was beside him, his presence as imposing as ever, a shadow in the dimly lit room. The mission they had been briefed on was unlike any other. The hunters, the alien mercenaries who had nearly taken Jacob's life, had been preparing for something big, something that would change the course of the galaxy's history. They were amassing an army, and their next target was Earth. The gravity of the situation was clear. The war had escalated, and it was no longer just about survival. It was about sending a message that humanity would no longer be a passive player in the galaxy. It was time to fight back. Jacob, we don't have much time. We need to hit them before they reach Earth. Reaper's voice cut through the air, calm and measured, as always. Reaper, we won't just hit them. We'll make them regret ever coming after us. Jacob turned to face him, studying the cold determination in Reaper's stance. It wasn't just about revenge. This was personal now. The hunters had crossed a line, and humanity would make sure they would never cross it again. But Jacob knew the road ahead was perilous. He had no illusions about the dangers they faced. Jacob, but we can't do this alone. We need allies. We need to unite the different factions, the different races we've been fighting for so long. If we don't, Reaper, then we die alone. The words were simple, but they hit hard. Jacob understood. Alone, they stood no chance. The galaxy was vast, filled with enemies and those who would never trust humanity. But that didn't matter. They had to try. They had to show the galaxy that humanity wasn't something to be dismissed. They were a force to be reckoned with. The briefing room was filled with representatives from every corner of the galaxy, alien diplomats, military commanders, and leaders who had once turned a blind eye to humanity's struggles. They sat around a massive table, their eyes narrowing as Jacob and Reaper stepped into the room. The moment they entered, the room fell silent. The reputation of Reaper had preceded them, and everyone in the room knew the gravity of what was at stake. Human diplomat, you've all heard the reports. The hunters are targeting Earth, and they will bring everything they have. We've tried to reach out to the other species, but they are hesitant. They've seen what humanity can do, but they're unsure of our place in this galaxy. This alliance, this war, we need your support. Jacob stood at the front, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. Jacob, we're not asking for help. We're offering you a chance to stand with us. The hunters won't stop at Earth. They'll move on to every world they can conquer. If we don't unite now, we risk losing everything. If you want to fight for the future, you need to join us. Reaper stood motionless by Jacob's side, his helmet fixed on the gathered leaders. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. The room was quiet for a long moment, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak, to take the first step. Finally, an alien diplomat, an insectoid species with large, reflective eyes, leaned forward. His voice was deep, and his words were carefully measured. Alien diplomat, we've watched humanity for years, and we've seen your resilience. But resilience isn't enough. You'll need more than hope to survive. You'll need strength, and that's something we have in abundance. The room hummed with a new energy as the various leaders began to murmur among themselves. Jacob knew the road ahead would be filled with distrust and skepticism, but this was a start. The first steps of a reluctant alliance were being forged. They had made the galaxy take notice. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy meetings, combat simulations, and resource allocations. The galaxy's fractured factions began to form a tenuous coalition, united by a common enemy. Jacob and Reaper led the charge, working together to convince the reluctant species to fight for the survival of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. As the time drew nearer for the assault on the hunter's stronghold, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still a question lingering in his mind. Jacob, Reaper, do you ever think about what happens after all of this? After the war? When the dust settles? Reaper didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was softer than usual, though still filled with resolve. Reaper, I've thought about it, but that's a question for later. Right now, we fight. Afterward, maybe there's a chance to build something better, but only if we win. Jacob nodded, the weight of the responsibility sinking deeper into his chest. The war was far from over, but they were making progress. Humanity's survival was no longer in question. They would fight, and they would win. And when the war ended, they would rebuild, not just as survivors, but as a force that could shape the future of the galaxy. The day of the final assault arrived. The hunters' stronghold loomed before them, a massive fortress built into the side of a barren moon. The combined fleet of humanity and their newfound allies stood ready for battle. Jacob stood on the bridge of their flagship, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. The ships were lined up in perfect formation, each one carrying the weight of millions of lives. Jacob, it's time. Reaper stood next to him, his face still hidden beneath his helmet. His posture was unwavering, a pillar of calm in the chaos that surrounded them. They both knew that the next few hours would determine the fate of the galaxy. They were ready. With a final look at Jacob, Reaper spoke, his voice steady and resolute. Reaper, let's end this. The battle was fierce. The hunters fought with everything they had, but they weren't prepared for the fury of a united galaxy. With Reaper leading the charge, humanity's forces tore through the enemy lines, crushing their defenses. The hunters underestimated the strength that came from a people who fought not just for their own survival, but for something greater. In the end, the hunters were defeated. Their forces scattered, their stronghold shattered. The galaxy had seen humanity rise from the ashes, and now they understood. Humanity wasn't just a force to be feared, they were a force to be respected. As the smoke cleared and the stars began to shine a little brighter, Jacob stood next to Reaper once again, looking out at the peaceful silence of space. "Jacob, we did it." Reaper didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The battle had been won, but the war within him, within all of them, was just beginning. They had forged something greater than survival. They had forged hope, and that hope would guide them forward into the future, a future where humanity was no longer a pawn in the galaxy's games, but a player in its own right. The end.